Before I begin my lecture today, the final lecture of the class, obviously, just a word or two about the final exam. So the final exam will be emailed to you this afternoon. It'll be emailed sometime between 1 and 5 p.m. Whenever I get a moment. And I have described to you on previous occasions the format of the exam. I'm going to describe it again because there's one new feature which is to your advantage. And that is namely, so the format is that you have three groups of questions, 1, 2, and 3. These are all essay questions. And you remember what I mentioned to you, it's mentioned on the syllabus, so there are no surprises here. You get 2 questions in group 1, you have to answer both of those. You don't have a choice there. So you answer 2 out of 2. Group 2, you have 2 questions, you answer 1 out of 2. Group 3, you answer 1 out of 2, which means you're answering 4 out of 6. Okay, but you do have to answer both of them from group 1. The new feature is there is a bonus question. Okay, let me tell you how the bonus question works. It's mentioned on the exam. The bonus question is a question that you can answer if you think you are able to answer it, and if you want to improve your grade. If your answer to that question is woefully inadequate or incorrect, marks will not be deducted. Okay, so you won't lose anything by answering that question. Right? But you could gain something by answering it. And what you could gain is 1/3 of a letter grade for the final exam. So let's supposing that you had a B+ on this final exam in this portion of it, which is the main portion. And if you do really well, or reasonably well, right, because you made a stab at it and you've done reasonably well on the bonus question, this grade can go up 1/3 of a letter grade, which means it can go up to an A-. So if you're getting a C, it can go up to a C+. If you're getting a B, it can go up to a B+. If you're getting a B-, it can go up to a B. Okay, but let me reiterate, you will not be harmed by answering the question. If you don't answer it properly, or of course you don't answer it all, it just stays neutral. It cannot harm you. All right, and so I thought that would be a way for some of you to try to improve your grade, because the final exam does constitute the major portion, relatively speaking, to anything else in the course. All right, any questions? I think you had a question.
So I see how the bonus will help us with
Yes.
this exam. You mentioned before that if you were really impressed by our effort, that maybe it would...
That will make a difference too.
Okay.
That will make a difference, yeah. That will make a difference. That's at 10%, which is at the instructor's discretion, which is mentioned on the syllabus. Some of you get the benefit of that because you've been active in class or you've been coming to see me, and I know who's coming to see me, who's active in class, right? But in other cases, it'll just stay neutral. Of course, if there are people who haven't showed up at all, well, then in that case, that 10% may go against them. But in general, in most cases, it will stay neutral. But if I see a real difference, if you got a C on your midterm and you're getting an A- on your final, well, then I'll see that, yeah, you've really put in an effort and you'll get rewarded for that as well. Yeah, so that 10% there will definitely, at that point, help you. Okay, and let me mention as a final note, you may not use the bonus question in lieu of one of these. You cannot answer 3 out of 6 of these and then say, I've answered the bonus, so I've answered 4 questions. No, you have to answer 4 out of those 6 questions in the major portion of the exam. The bonus question is exactly what it says. It's a bonus, right? And sometimes you get the bonus, and sometimes you don't, depending on what you do, right? But no one will be harmed by it. Yes.
Will the bonus question be the same length requirements?
Yeah, and they're all essay questions. They're all essay questions, right? There's no Mickey Mouse stuff here. No map quiz, no ID terms, nothing. Essay questions, right? If you haven't done the readings, some of the questions actually specifically mention a reading and say, what is it saying? So if you haven't done it, do it, right? As simple as that. Of course, you still have to interpret the reading. All right, any other clarifications? Once this lecture is over today, I cannot see any one of you. I had extended office hours yesterday. Only one student came to see me. So, you've had your last opportunity. But if you have any other questions, ask them at this point. The instructions are very, very explicit. Due date of the exam, you have 8 days to write it, 5 p.m. on Friday of exam week. Okay? Friday of exam week, 5 p.m. And it has to be emailed to me as a Word document, not as a PDF, but it's all mentioned on the final exam. Okay? All right. Let us proceed with our narrative. In my concluding remarks to you on Tuesday, I had been talking to you about the great trial, as it's known, of Mohandas Gandhi, right? 1922. He's put on trial on charges of sedition. And if you look here, 1922, he had launched a non-cooperation movement. I have to impress upon you the fact, that this is a world historical event that you're talking about. At no previous point in history can one think of a mass movement of resistance grounded in the principles of nonviolence. Right? And of course, I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that there haven't been people in history who may not have used nonviolence in some particular fashion or the other. And I mentioned to you Henry David Thoreau, but one of the groups of people that has interested me for a long time is what are called the Doukhobors of Russia. A kind of a pacifist group, who rebelled against the authority of the Tsar. Many of them emigrated eventually to Canada. And they were funded by Leo Tolstoy. So there have been groups like that. But again, those are very small groups. This is really a movement in India that galvanizes the entire population. And whatever its success or failures, the very fact that a non-cooperation movement of this kind was launched initiates a new moment, really, in history and a new moment in human consciousness, frankly. All right? So Gandhi is now going to be put on trial. The movement lost last, and it's going to come to an end in 1922. In 1921, by the way, if you read official British archive records, which I have, and historians who worked on this have, it's very clear that the non-cooperation movement had virtually paralyzed British administration in some parts of North India. Right? Because to some extent the principles were those that were embodied in the Swadeshi movement: boycott of British institutions, boycott of British textiles. Withdraw. Why is it called non-cooperation? Withdraw your cooperation from the rulers. And this goes back to Gandhi's argument in Swaraj that no project of colonialism is possible without the complicity of the colonized. Without the complicity of the colonized. That some Indians, it's not a matter of simply welcoming the British with open arms, that not all Indians welcome the British with open arms, but in some fashion or the other, people become complicit in regimes of oppression. Right? You see that there's an opening for you, that your interests might be advanced, so forth and so on. And so, non-cooperation movement, that title is significant precisely because what Gandhi was saying, we Indians have to learn not to cooperate with the British. The moment we cease to cooperate, in the fullest sense of the term, British rule in India will come to an end. And that's what the movement was. 1922, early 1922, Gandhi he's been publishing these articles. He had founded several newspapers. He's going to be then tried on charges of sedition and treason against the British, because the British view themselves, of course, as a legally constituted authority in India, and he's going to be put on trial. And as I had mentioned to you in my closing remarks, he's going to be given a sentence of 6 years and eventually going to be released in 3 years in 1925. And that speech that he makes at his trial is a momentous work, because it's also an extraordinary indictment of colonial rule. Gandhi, like many of these Indian nationalists, was an absolute master of the English prose. So, it's also an extraordinary work in literary terms as well. Now, 1925, Gandhi is going to be released from prison. But one of the things that I must mention to you, which is, like everything else in this course, a subject for a huge lecture in itself, and that is that, it is very common to view Gandhi as
a freedom fighter, as a political figure, as an architect of Indian independence and all of that. But Gandhi expended a lot more energy on what he called the constructive program, because he understood, unlike his colleagues in the Indian National Congress, that liberating India from colonial rule was not going to liberate all Indians, or in fact any Indians at all, really, right? Because freedom is not just political freedom, it's economic freedom, social freedom, cultural freedom. Right? And in fact, when independence arrived in 1947, one of the last things he wrote is something like what is called his last will and testament in a fashion. What he wrote was that, well, we have gained political freedom, but we haven't gained economic, social, and cultural freedom. Now, this constructive program was designed to address that. But what did the constructive program do? The revitalization of the Indian village. Gandhi worked towards the abolition of untouchability. Right? So the untouchables were those who were the lower castes, the ones who had been completely marginalized from Indian society, who performed jobs that no one else would. As things I've spoken to you about in passing before, people who were scavengers, who made their living from scavengers. They had no choice. It's not something that they do this out of choice. Right? People who are ostracized and outcasted in many ways. So they are called the untouchables. Gandhi works actively towards the eradication of untouchability. He works actively for Hindu-Muslim unity. Right? All of this and a great deal more, such as, for example, the reliance on spinning and weaving in order to generate more income, the revival of Indian cottage industries. All of this is part of what he calls the constructive program. And so Gandhi is enormously busy in that. I mean, there was no one who traveled the length and breadth of India and got to know India's villages as Gandhi did. I mean, this man went everywhere. Right? So in this sense also, he is very different from his fellow elites. I say fellow elites because Gandhi, of course, was a highly educated man, at least highly educated by the standards of those days. You know, he'd gotten a law degree and all of that, a highly educated man. But in this sense, he was very different. And some of his fellow colleagues in the Indian National Congress Party and fellow Indian nationalists criticized him because they said, well, you know, all of these are things we're going to attend to once we have independence. We need to secure our political freedom from colonial rule. And this constructive program is a distraction. And Gandhi's argument was, no, it's not a distraction. This is central and integral to the whole project of independence, because if we ignore this now, we will certainly ignore this when we become free. And there's no questioning the fact that Gandhi was, again, entirely right on this particular point. So 1925, even when he's in jail, he's writing, he's educating himself, he's reading for those 3 years that he's in prison. And in fact, actually, like many figures of his stature, prison was in fact a welcome interlude. It was a way to get some rest, you know, right? So there's a whole history to be written about how prison, in fact, is something that political figures, in fact, very often welcome. You know, partly because, as I said, it's a way of rejuvenating their soul and their body. But he's engaged in the constructive program, and he continues to be engaged in the constructive program when he comes out of jail over the next several years. Now, 1930, he's going to launch, because, of course, there's a political pressure is building up. When do we actually get our freedom? By this point in time, late 1920s, there is no question that everyone is squarely for independence. There's no halfway house now. There are no longer people saying, well, we just want limited, you know, self-determination, limited autonomy. We can be a colony like Australia or Canada, a white colony. No. The argument is we want complete and full independence. Right? So in 1930, Gandhi is going to launch the Salt Satyagraha. And this, too, is an event unparalleled in history, I would argue. Not just unparalleled in the history of colonial India. Because it begins with an oddity. The oddity is that Gandhi is thinking, what can I do to mobilize, to galvanize my people? Right? And then it strikes him that what I'm going to do is, I'm going to break the salt law. And so what does he do? He writes a letter to the Viceroy. And this tells you, by the way, a lot about the principles of nonviolence, right? The Viceroy is, of course, the the person who's ruling India on behalf of the British. And I can tell you that Gandhi is the only revolutionary who would inform his opponents beforehand, this is what I'm going to do. Right? Now here, this is what I'm going to do. You have an option to come and arrest me before I undertake this measure or to lock me away. I mean, can you imagine somebody like Lenin, you know, the author of the Bolshevik Revolution? By the way, you know, we're just celebrating the 100th anniversary, which just started a few days ago, the Bolshevik Revolution, in March 12th, 1917. I mean, can you imagine Lenin informing, you know, the Tsar's secret police, well, hey, this is what I'm going to do on such and such date, come and get me, you know, right? Revolution is not a tea party, let me assure you, right? But what did Gandhi do? He writes a letter to the viceroy, says, you know, salt is a commodity that everybody has to use. In a hot tropical country like that, it is an absolute essential commodity. There's a tax. The British had a monopoly on the production, distribution, and sale of salt. In fact, the salt tax generated a considerable amount of revenue for the British, and there were years when it was among the top 3 revenue earners for the British government. So Gandhi says, I'm going to defy the salt law. And how am I going to defy the salt law? I'm going to march from my ashram. The ashram is this kind of communal, you know, living arrangement that he had devised, if I may put it this way. And I'm going to march from Ahmedabad to the sea. This is a march that's going to be that is going to take place over a period of 21 days, approximately 3 weeks. It's a distance of something over 200 miles. And I'm going to walk this entire distance. And when I arrive at the sea, I'm going to break the salt law. What am I going to do? I'm going to actually make salt. Right? That's what he says. And now when the viceroy got the letter, you can imagine they had a bit of a chuckle over it. Right? They, you know, the viceroy and his colleagues sit down and they say, this cranky old man, he just won't give up. Now he thinks he's going to break the salt law and he's going to defy the British. So, of course, they completely ignored him. He writes an extraordinary letter to the viceroy saying, this is what I expect to do. You know, I beg you on bended knee to listen to what I'm saying. What was he doing? He was obviously galvanizing the country around this whole idea of the defiance of the British by breaking the salt law. Right? The salt becomes symbolic. So this becomes known as the Salt Satyagraha, and it had an extraordinary effect. This is when Gandhi undoubtedly becomes a household name, not just in India, but in large parts of the world, because there were correspondents from all over the world. They would never seen anything like that. Because when he sets out on the Salt March, he handpicks 78 followers, but by the time, you know, by the time they get to the sea, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who are following him, and they converge on the sea. And then all over India, it is basically a signal for people to break the salt law. They had to put 100,000 people in jail within a couple of weeks. I mean, they just had no room in the jails anymore. To get to the gist of it, the most significant thing is that once this happens, the British, for the first time, have to concede that yes, there is a legitimate demand for independence emanating from the Indian public, and we are going to negotiate with Mr. Gandhi. And the person who understood the significance of that, because again, there's a whole critical literature that these negotiations were unsuccessful, the British were very devious and cunning, you know, that's the argument. They basically gave away nothing. Right? But the person who understood that this was now the writing on the wall, this was the end, the beginning of the end of British rule in India, was, of course, Winston Churchill, right? Who was, for the first half of the 20th century, the major British political figure. And, of course, as you know, one of the few people who was recognized in the United States as an extraordinary, you know, friend of the U.S. because the fact that he led Britain during the war, during the Second War, in resistance to Hitler and the Nazis. But the person who understood what this signified was Churchill, a man who was, by the way, an outright racist in every sense of the term. I mean, you know, we cannot mince words when we talk about Churchill's racism. So what does he say? He says, the spectacle of a half-naked fakir. Half-naked fakir. Fakir is a holy man of a kind known in the East. as it were. The spectacle of a half-naked fakir walking up the steps of the viceregal palace to parley, to speak, to converse, to parley on equal terms with the representative of the king emperor, the viceroy, is too nauseating and disgusting to behold. Right? Those are the words of Winston Churchill, right, who says that this is atrocious that we should be sitting with this half-naked monkey, right? That's really what he's thinking to himself. Right? And the significance of it was, yes, that now the British finally said, yeah, we're negotiating, because they had never negotiated with an Indian leader for independence. So what this is going to lead to is the Roundtable Conferences, 1930 to 1932. It's a second Roundtable Conference, late 1931, which is really extraordinarily important. I'm just going to give you a minute capsule of that, because what it was actually another attempt by the British to try to divide India, to divide the opposition, to divide the resistance. What did they do? They basically said every Indian group or constituency is allowed to send a representative. So they try to argue that the Congress was in fact just another Indian organization. Just another Indian organization. So Anglo-Indians, for example, a very small number of people, they were allowed to send a representative. Of course, the Muslim League was allowed to send a representative. The Parsis, the Jews, the Christians. Because the argument was, well, if there's going to be independence, if there's going to be some kind of self-determination or freedom, how do we ensure that all these minorities, right, get protection? How do we ensure that? Because the bulk of the people in India are Hindus, 75% of the population is Hindu, or 70% in undivided India, 25% Muslim, 25% Muslim, and then you've got Christians, Sikhs, Jews, Parsis, Anglo-Indians, and of course what were called the depressed classes, right? The depressed classes. So if you just look over here for a moment, right, then we'll go back to that slide. So who are the key players that we're talking about now in the last years, which are going to eventually, of British rule, which are eventually going to lead to Indian independence? So we have Gandhi, of course, the leader. I put leader in quotation marks because he is not officially the president of the Congress. He was officially president of the Congress for only 1 year in 1925, because Gandhi was one of those people who was, if I may put it this way, such a gigantic figure that he didn't need an office. Right? He didn't need an office. It's like being president of the U.S. without being president, right? But I'm not talking about Steve Bannon here, by the way, all right? Nothing remotely resembling that. No, I'm talking about a man who was, in that sense, the dictator of the Congress. Namely, that you could not have a decision passed without the stamp of approval of Gandhi, right? That's what it means. But he is not an official leader. And the other reason why it's in quotation marks is that Gandhi was drifting apart from all the other leaders of the Congress. It started in the 1930s, and of course by the mid-1940s that had become very significant moment in Indian history, right? He was departing partly because, unlike all his fellow congressmen, Gandhi adhered to the idea of nonviolence not as a matter of policy, right? But as a matter of creed, as a matter of belief. What do I mean by that? That many people went along with Gandhi, I am saying, including those who became his closest disciples, because they said nonviolence is the most effective way to resist the British. But the moment it ceases to be effective, right, we withdraw our support. For Gandhi, nonviolence was always effective. If it didn't work, it wasn't because it was a problem with nonviolence. It was a problem with the practitioner of nonviolence. That the practitioner of nonviolence did not fully understand the principles of nonviolence or was not adhering to it, was tempted to resort to violence. And it's very easy to resort to violence, particularly if you are tempted and provoked. As I had mentioned to you, for example, and during what happened in the civil rights movement, if people are beating you up, you might just physically be tempted at that point to retaliate. Right? So there are these differences. So there are lots of reasons why Gandhi is drifting apart, and that's what I mean when I say leader of the Indian National Congress. Then you have the Congress, which the other major figures who are close associates and lieutenants of Gandhi, as it were, people like Jawaharlal Nehru, who would go on to become the first Prime Minister of Free India in 1947, Vallabhbhai Patel, and others. Then you have the Muslim League, founded, recall, in 1906. Right? With the active encouragement of the British, the argument being that the Muslim League was going to represent the Muslims of India. It was going to represent the Muslims of India, an argument that the Congress rejected because the Congress said, we represent everyone. Right? This is a pan-Indian organization. But the Muslim League is going to start to drift apart really substantially beginning in the late 1930s. And it is going to be headed by a man called Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who is then going to become known eventually as the author of the idea of Pakistan. There are various other people who have been described as authors of the idea of Pakistan. What is Pakistan? The country that was going to emerge with independence in 1947, and the partition of India, right? A separate nation for the Muslims. But then you also had what were called nationalist Muslims. And who are the nationalist Muslims? The nationalist Muslims are those who reject explicitly the argument of the Muslim League. Right? They reject the argument that Hindus and Muslims are two separate nations. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah is going to make a very famous speech in 1940 in a city called Lahore in Western India in the Punjab. Right? And at that time, the Muslim League in 1940 passes a resolution called the Lahore Resolution, sometimes also known colloquially as the Pakistan resolution. Right? But the word Pakistan does not appear in that resolution. It's important to note that. Right? Just as, for example, again, and this is the reason you might think that, well, I'm really very interested in this whole issue. Well, I am and I'm not. But I use modern day parallels from 2017 because you can understand some of these things better. That the Lahore Resolution, and I'll tell you what the parallel is. The Lahore Resolution is a resolution passed by the Muslim League at the instigation of its leader Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which says that the Hindus and the Muslims are two nations, and these two nations cannot live together. Right? These two people cannot live together. Now it's known as the Pakistan resolution because effectively many people are saying we can read into it an argument for the creation of Pakistan, that Muhammad Ali Jinnah is saying the Muslims of India deserve to have a separate nation of their own. But the word Pakistan does not appear. Now, what is a modern day parallel? The so-called Muslim ban. Go and read the executive order signed by Donald J. Trump. Both the one that was re-signed and the new one which has now been blocked as well, neither of them mention the word Muslim. Neither of them mention that word. Why is it called a Muslim ban? Because then, of course, you have to read into it. And you say, these are all Muslim majority countries from where these people are going to be blocked. And of course, you read it in relation to a great many other things that have been said by Mr. Trump and a number of his friends and associates, right? That is exactly what is going on, if I may put it this way, in 1940 with the Lahore Resolution. Now the nationalist Muslims are those Indian Muslims who say, we reject that argument. So they are anti-communal, right? We reject this argument because India is our mother country. It is our homeland. We have as much right to India as any Hindu or any Sikh. Right? We claim this country as our own, and in fact, the nationalist Muslims, led by Maulana Azad, who is a member of the Indian National Congress, the INC is the Indian National Congress, right, are going to argue, right, that the Muslim of India is always an Indian first, right? Always an Indian first, and that the Muslims of India have, together with the Hindus and the other groups, forged a very distinct, unique civilization. He's going to take that view. There are others too. I'm just giving you in each case one or two representatives of that point of view. Right? And then there are some other major players, but I'm going to come to them in just a few moments because I need to go back to the main narrative before I bring in some of the other figures, right? So what was a roundtable conference? It was what the British invited all of these delegates and said, well, we'll sit down at a round table, as it were, and we're going to have a conference to determine the future, the political future of India. Now, these roundtable conferences did not, of course, deliver independence. Right? In the meantime, however, 1931, because this is a problem I've spoken to you about at some length in this course, and I did that in one of my previous lectures, just a few days ago, and that is the problem of communalism. Communalism, which is what I've been referring to when I've been talking about Muhammad Ali Jinnah as well and the Muslim League, right? And so, what is communalism? Once again, you have a very important reading by Gyan Pandey, which was on the subject of communalism and what he calls the making of the communal riot narrative. All right. So, what is the argument? Very briefly, let me revisit the question of communalism, because now we're going to see what its link is to what happens in 1947, right? When the demand for independence has been conceded, but the demand for Pakistan has also now become irresistible. Right? So what is Gyan Pandey saying? First, a riot takes place between Hindus and Muslims. Right? You can transpose it to your terms if you want, racial riot if you want, okay, in the US, between blacks and whites. Right? You could, if you wanted to, you could transpose it to those terms, with significant differences, of course. So there's a riot that takes place, and a riot can take place for a number of different reasons. Now, the British view was, remember the whole theory of communalism, the communalist interpretation of Indian history, that this riot has taken place because this is the nature of Indian history. Hindus and Muslims represent two completely different religious worldviews. And these two religions and their adherents cannot inhabit the same space peacefully. They cannot. Because an Indian is always a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh, whatever the case may be, before he or she is anything else. And all Hindus will gravitate towards Hindus, all Muslims will gravitate towards Muslims, and the interests of these religious communities are extremely diverse. And what he does in this piece, which is a really fantastic illustration of how to do a certain kind of history, is he shows how a communal riot, as it were, that takes place in the city of Banaras in North India in early 1800s is now going to become the occasion for the British to extrapolate from that to the entire history of India. So this communal riot basically could have taken place anywhere from the point of view of the British. It is not a local riot from the point of view of the British. It is simply a local instantiation, that is, a local illustration, if I may put it this way, of a national problem, a national phenomenon. So what are the British doing here? When Gyan Pandey says communal riot narrative, what he's saying is that when, in fact, a communal riot took place, a religious riot between Hindus and Muslims, whatever the magnitude of that, what would the British do? They would immediately create an official record. That's the communal riot narrative. That official record was usually in the form of the report of a committee or commission of inquiry. Right? Commission of inquiry. You appoint a commission, let's find out why these Hindus and Muslims started fighting with each other, why the police had to intervene, and why they had to fire at the crowd. Right? That's the communal riot narrative. And so what of course, Gyan Pandey is arguing is that this is really a way of suggesting that this is the inevitable nature of Indian history. And this is where you have to think about that earlier argument about transcendence, that we, the British, are there, right, to keep the peace between all these warring factions and warring groups, and we are above all of this. We are above all of this. Right? So in the communal riot, the Kanpur riots, I mentioned these ones specifically because this was a major riot, where several hundred people are killed. And the Indians, of course, are going to have to start thinking as well about what is really happening here and whether communalism has actually now become something of a force, right? Partially with, of course, the instigation of the British themselves, right? So this is what's happening in the 1930s, and then from 32 to 1940, roughly, 1939 is what? The beginning of World War II, right? In all these years, what's happening in these 7-8 years is that Gandhi is busy with the Constructive program. There obviously, the pressure for independence is really building up, right? But Gandhi has not initiated another major movement. So the first major movement was 1920-22, then you have the Salt Satyagraha, and then, of course, in 1942, you're going to have what is called the final movement, right? Which is going to be called the Quit India movement. However, a number of other developments in the meantime, right? So now we're moving into the 1940s, just on the cusp, verge of what will eventually become independence. And the major thing to take note of, I personally do not view it as something that is extraordinarily important, but I can tell you in many parts of India, particularly in Bengal, for example, this is viewed as highly significant, and that is what is called the creation of the Indian National Army in 1941 by Subhas Chandra Bose. All right, so let me move to this slide over here, because the key players I was talking about, I didn't come to the last bit over there. Subhas Chandra Bose. Who is Subhas Chandra Bose? Subhas Chandra Bose was a major figure in the Indian nationalist movement. He had been the president of the Congress, but needless to say, I'm really truncating and simplifying this, okay? And this is really strictly my reading of Bose, because there are others who will disagree with that. You cannot disagree with the empirical data here, because that is widely known, which is that Subhas Chandra Bose essentially advocated the philosophy that my enemy's enemy is my friend. Okay? So he's an Indian nationalist. His enemy is who? The British. Okay? And their enemy are the Nazis, and the Nazis therefore are my friend. And that is exactly what Subhash Bose would do. Namely what? 1939, he is the president of the Indian National Congress. So he's up there with Gandhi. And there's no question that there are at least a few parts of India, and among some people for whom Subhash Bose was held in the same reverence as Gandhi was. But he's going to drift apart from Gandhi and the Congress. He's going to drift apart from Gandhi and the Congress, a long narrative over there. He's going to be put under house arrest by the British. He's going to have this miraculous escape in the middle of the night while he's under house arrest, and he's going to flee the country, and eventually he's going to end up in Germany, where he's going to stay there for a couple of years. There's a long and interesting history, by the way, of great Indian political figures and intellectuals having liaisons with German women. That's a whole new chapter which I cannot even open up, but he's one of those, okay, figures. And so Subhash Bose is going to go to Germany, where he had lived there before as well, and eventually he is going to enter into a collaboration with the Nazis. So the Nazis are going to give him radio space. He's going to have a radio station where he's going to broadcast against the British, right? And eventually he's going to get an audience with Adolf Hitler. But of course, Hitler was a rank racist, so he didn't really have much time for brown-skinned Indians, except if they were convenient to him. And Hitler found that, well, that even though Subhash Bose had forged an alliance, that he was not an obsequious slave, which is what Hitler expected him to be. So what's going to happen eventually is he's going to leave Germany, and he's going to go then to the other great imperialist Axis power, and I'm talking here about Japan, right? So he's going to eventually land up with a collaboration with the Japanese, and he's going to be killed in a plane crash in 1945. In the meantime, however, what is it that he has done? He has founded what is called the Indian National Army, right? Also known as the Azad Hind Fauj, the Indian term. Fauj is army, right? Azad means free. So Free Indian Army. Now, what was the Indian National Army? You know, British India, of course, had the Army of British India. Right? And that was the army where tens of thousands of Indians fought for the British Empire, World War I and World War II. Correct? Right? What is going to happen here is that Bose is going to say, we cannot match the British simply through nonviolent resistance. And particularly the terms of the war have changed everything. The World War II has completely changed the geopolitical picture, and he's looking to see an alliance, how an alliance with the Nazis and with the Japanese, you know, can possibly help India achieve independence as quickly as possible. Because, of course, like many others in Asia, is hopeful of the fact that the Japanese will triumph, which initially it looked like they were. If you think about the fall of Singapore, for example, in 1942, right? That the Japanese at one point, much like the Germans, until of course 1941, when finally the Germans are starting to be pushed back. But if you look at the initial years of the Blitzkrieg, 1939, September 1939, and all the way till 1940, it looks like the Germans were absolutely going to be able to dominate, right? And then you get the setbacks, and this is what happens with the Japanese in Southeast Asia. And the Japanese are on the border with India, so eventually they're going to be fighting on that border there with Burma and Northeast India. Now, the Indian National Army is an army comprised of two different elements. One is Indians who had fought for the British, right, for the Indian Army, for the official Indian Army, and who had been captured. For example, in North Africa, right, who had been captured. So these people were what? POWs, prisoners of war. They had been taken captive by the Germans. And when Subhash Bose allies himself with the Nazis, he says to the Nazis, would you please release all of these Indian soldiers, because they are going to help me fight the British Indian Army, for whom, on behalf of whom they were fighting before. You know, I'm going to give them a new ideology, okay, of independence, right? So the Indian Army that he's going to put together, the INA as it's called, right? And it's actually an army. I mean, you know, so they're regiments and they're marching and they're drills. They don't do that much fighting. There is quite a bit of fighting on the northeast frontier in India, and you know, the Burma border around there. They're going to have enter into a number of battles with the British, but by and large, it's not an army which is engaged in the full-scale way in which some other armies were, of course, at that time. Right? So this is going to be one element of the Indian National Army, these captured Indian POWs who are going to be essentially turned over to Bose. And the other element is that there was a large population of Indians who had been living in Southeast Asia. For example, the descendants of the indentured laborers who had been living in the Malay world, in the Malay archipelago, in Singapore, in places like that. And many of these people are going to be seduced and lured into becoming part of the Indian National Army, and that's, in fact, the Indian National Army headquarters is going to be in Southeast Asia. Right? So this is the figure of Bose that we're talking about, and he is a major player of that time. And even though, as I said, I find his politics absolutely reprehensible because of the alliance that he forged with the Nazis and with totalitarian states, notwithstanding that, what is interesting about Bose is that in many other respects, he was an extraordinarily liberal figure. A very, very progressive figure. I mean, if you read what he has to say about the working class movements, and he did not have a communal bone in his body, by which I mean that he could not be seduced by this whole narrative that the Hindus and the Muslims are separate, and I'm a Hindu, so I'm going to agitate for the rights of Hindus only. No time for questions right now, right? It was not, he did not have that kind of communal bone in his body. Right? He was extremely secular, progressive figure in that sense. But, as I said, on the larger question of political alliances, I think he adopted a view which cannot be defended at all. Right? So this is Subhash Bose that we're talking about. So when we're drifting into the 1940s now, And this is one last detail before we get to the final stages of negotiation for independence, because, of course, 1945, the war comes to a close, right? Germany has been defeated. Several months later, Japan is going to, after the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Japanese are going to say that, yes, we're prepared to do an unconditional surrender, and that's going to bring the war to an end, both in the Pacific. It had already come to an end in Europe. Right? And 1945, when the war comes to an end, the British realize that, well, this is it. That the empire can no longer last. Britain itself is in shambles, of course, to a considerable degree, as were the other European economies. But the demand for independence is built. But what is that one crucial data that I need to give you in order for you to understand the implications of what I am talking about here, right, when we move into the period from 1945 to 1947? And that is that in 1939, when World War II broke out, the Congress adopted a position of neutrality. Neutrality. The British did not like that. Did not like that. Because the British view was, well, we are fighting fascism. We're fighting totalitarianism. Everyone has a responsibility to fight fascism and totalitarianism. And of course, people like Gandhi very wisely, and you didn't even have to be very wise to be able to say what he was going to say. You simply had to look at the situation, said what? We are being subjected to colonial oppression for 200 years. Why the hell should we be fighting for you against the Nazis? What distinguishes you? Gandhi is going to tell the British, what distinguishes you from the Nazis? Why should we think that colonialism and fascism are really two different beasts? They're both beasts. Why should we think they're different beasts? I mean, that's the nutshell of the argument. And of course, Gandhi's view and the view of the Congress, and at this point the Congress is going along with Gandhi completely on this matter, 1939, is that yes, I mean, unless we have an absolute assurance, which the British were not giving, not even remotely, absolute assurance of full independence at the termination of the war, we are not going to lend our support to the war. So the Congress adopted this position of neutrality. What is the response of the British? They're going to lock up all of these people in jail. However, this is the crucial data. The Muslim League said, we will support the British. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah and all the Muslim League leaders basically have a free hand. And what is very significant, and this is, you know, there are books and books that have been written trying to analyze this whole situation, of course, as you can imagine. But what is undoubtedly true is that as late as 1937, when they had the last provincial elections, right? Because you remember I told you that there's limited political autonomy, legislative assemblies, all of that. You know, of course, you know, franchise is still restricted to very few people in India at this point in time. As late as 1937, when they had provincial elections, right, or elections to the provincial legislative assemblies, the Muslim League did not win very many votes. Indeed, even in areas where the Muslims constituted a substantial majority, right? And certain portions of the Punjab. So if you look at the undivided map of India, right, so, and this is going to become Pakistan over here, or West Pakistan, and this is going to become East Pakistan, which we'll get to that in about 10 minutes' time, what happens in the partition. I'm talking about the further west you are here, these are very substantial Muslim majority areas, well over 50%, right? Even in many of these areas, the Muslim League did not get the support of the majority of Muslims. It was still the Indian National Congress. However, what happens is, right, and this is the conventional narrative. In this case, I'm going along with it because we can complicate it, but it has merit. And that is that when the Congress leaders get put in jail and the Muslim League leaders are all free now, those years of wilderness for the Indian National Congress become boom years for the Muslim League. That is that there's no competition. There's no competition. They can go and they can proselytize. They can go and talk to people, persuade them, seduce them. Right? The Congress is substantially not in the picture. Right? And we're going to find that the support that the Muslim League is able to get is going to increase very substantially during the years of World War II. Right? During the years of World War II. 1942, so it was 1942, war started 39, it was 1942 that the Congress leaders are going to be all put in jail. 1942, what is Gandhi going to do? He's going to launch what is called the Quit India movement. Do or die, as he says to his people. He gives a mantra, right? Do or die. This is the last final push. We're fed up with the British, right? And again, there's a long, complicated history to the Quit India movement. Why is there a long, complicated history? Because what is undoubtedly true is that there were going to be many episodes of violence. So, and this included such things as sabotaging British properties, sabotaging railway lines. In World War II, this was becoming important, because even though the bulk of India itself was not actually invaded or attacked, but the mobilization for the war was taking place, throughout India, right? And there were Indian soldiers, of course, and they were being trained who were sent to fight for the war, so forth and so on. So basically, India was on a war footing, and there was always the threat of a Japanese invasion, right? There was always the threat of Japanese invasion. So what you have is during the Quit India movement, when Gandhi issues this call, do or die, to his people, saying to the British, literally, he's saying to the British, quit India, leave it. Leave us to our own misery or fortune, as the case may be. And that's what the Quit India movement is. And it's going to be accompanied by these episodes of violence where British railway lines, British police stations, all of these are going to be attacked. So there are considerable acts of sabotage from 1942 onwards when Gandhi issues this call. And virtually all of this, by the way, the leadership is all underground. So the vast majority of the Congress leaders have been put on jail. Some of them were able to escape the dragon net that the British had put, right? And what do? They basically go underground and they start trying to forge a movement of resistance, right? So this is all being directed from the underground in 1942, 1943. But the day that Gandhi issued the Quit India resolution, within 24 hours, he and the entire top leadership of the Congress is going to be arrested. That is the time when the Muslim League is now going to start to become important. Right? They are going to be able to gain the support because the Congress's leaders are going to be in jail for 2 years until 1944 when they're going to be released. And then, of course, you have the end of the war in 45. And when the war ends, there is a declaration made by the Prime Minister. Long story why Churchill was not the Prime Minister, why he was voted out of office, even though he had led the country to even though he led Britain against Hitler and the forces of fascism. But a man called, what's his name? Not Leo Amery, Attlee. Clement Attlee is going to become the British Prime Minister in 1945 from the Labour Party. And Attlee is basically going to issue a declaration saying Britain is willing to sit down with Indian leaders to negotiate for the immediate independence of India. All right? So that is what is going to now launch the negotiations for Indian independence, all right, in 1945. Now, we don't need to look into these negotiations in great detail, right? There are a great many initiatives. What is the issue? Because you might say to yourself, well, what are they negotiating about? Isn't simply a matter of saying, okay, we agree to leave India and we turn the country over to you? Well, of course not. Right? What there is to negotiate about is precisely the fact that Lahore Resolution of 1940, also known, as I pointed out to you, as the Pakistan resolution of 1940. Right? And take your mind back to the first partition of Bengal, 1905, and the Swadeshi movement. And why had that partition been effected by the British? Partially because it was a first attempt to implement in a big way the whole policy of divide and rule. Of course, the British argued that Bengal is just too large a state, needs to be administratively much more efficient, so therefore we need to cut it up into two halves. And of course, very conveniently, they cut it up into the Muslim half and the so-called Hindu half. Now, the first thing you need to understand is that when we speak of a Muslim majority area or a Hindu majority area, right, this does not mean that only Muslims are living in a Muslim majority area. All right? The problem that you have to really attempt to understand is that Muslims and Hindus in many parts of the country were inhabiting the same space, very often the same village. And this is apart from the question which I have also addressed on a number of occasions here, and that is that how do we call a person a Hindu in the first place or a Muslim in the first place? Because there are many kinds of Hindus. Right? You could be a Vaishnava, you could be a Shakto, you could be a Shaivite, you could be a Tantric, so forth and so on. So this was a corporate identity that is imposed upon them, right? And such things as the census, for example, had a great deal to do with it. So what are we saying? What we're saying, before we get to the question of what was going to happen here in 47, right, 46 leading to independence and partition in 47, we're saying that it is not possible, really, to simply say that this area is Muslim, this area is Hindu. Well, of course, there are some areas where the vast majority or where nearly everybody might have been Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or Christian, as the case may be. But we're saying for the bulk of the places in India, there were populations that were interspersed, where even questions of identity were not as easy as the British thought they were, right? Easily resolved, that we know who these people are, right? That these identities themselves are intermingled, interspersed, and indeed they're embodied in all kinds of different ways. Now, when the Lahore Resolution is passed, and in the years after that, in the few years after that, the Muslim League came around to the view, especially when it became clear in 1945, when Clement Attlee becomes the Prime Minister and says, now on behalf of the British government, I'm saying that we are going to leave India. We're going to try to achieve self-determination as quickly as possible. All right? So now, at 45, the Muslim League is saying, well, what about the Muslims? Right? What place are we going to have in a unified, united India? They're saying we are a religious minority. And of course, there's no reason to say that a religious minority necessarily needs its own home. Why should that be the case? Right? And this is, again, apart from the question which I really cannot tackle here, but I just want to alert you to it, namely that this idea of majority and minority is itself a very modern idea. Many of you might find this difficult to swallow, but let me tell you that people did not always think of themselves as minorities or majorities. This is a kind of modern political arithmetic. For those of you who do political science, you should think about this, right? It's a modern kind of political arithmetic where you say a group of people is minority. Because what if a group of people is numerically a minority, but in fact do not think of themselves as a minority because they're privileged, for example, right? Or they have never faced discrimination. The Jews in India never faced any discrimination. The Parsis never faced any discrimination. Then there are majorities, And I'll give you an example. For example, white Americans living in the Rust Belt, whose whole claim, and that is what led to Mr. Trump in 2016, whose whole claim is, oh, you know, we are like minorities in our own country. You know, Muslims are being favored. Mr. Trump said that. Muslims are being favored. They are allowed into the country, but Christians are not being allowed into the country. Right? If you read the first executive order. You see, this is a majority. They're a majority who are now beginning to think like a minority. These are mental constructs. The psychogeography of this is very important. Now, the problem here in South Asia was that, all right, you have these, and by the way, when we're talking about Muslim minority, right, so the population of undivided India is, let's say, roughly 400 million. Right? And the Muslim population is 20 to 25%, let's say. Well, that's a very substantial number. Right? But they're being told by their own leaders that in an undivided India, we're going to be the slaves of the Hindus. You know, we're going to be the slaves of the Hindus, or we are going to be discriminated against. What assurance do we have? Right? Of course, you could ask, what assurance did you have under colonial India? Because every Indian was discriminated against. But that argument is never going to strike them, right? Because the idea is that, well, that was in the past. Now we have to think about what our future will be post-independence. So there is going to be a demand that there should be a separate nation state for the Muslims. However, the question now is going to be, well, how do you create that separate nation state? Because the two major, I mean really major areas of Muslim population are here and here. This is Bengal, right? And this, of course, is Punjab, right? And of course, further west here, you know, you get into areas that are almost largely Muslim, right? Afghanistan and then Central Asia, but that's not our concern. However, then there are cities such as this city over here called Hyderabad, right? Then there's a city over here in the north called Lucknow. These are all cities that you should be familiar with by now, right? All of these have substantial Muslim populations. So if you're going to create a separate nation state for the Muslims, well, you can't create 20 separate nation states for the Muslims. You're going to create one, right? Well, how are you going to create it? Because what will happen to all of these people in Bengal? Imagine that, and by the way, the largest Muslim population numerically, not area-wise, numerically is Bengal, right? So let's supposing this is where the nation state is going to be. Are all the Muslims going to come from here to here, and from here, and here, and what about the tens of thousands of villages where there are Muslims here and there, right? What are you going to do? Right? So this is why there's going to be negotiations. And I cannot give you the whole narrative of the negotiations, obviously, here, but the gist of it is that early 1946, 1947, there are a number of other considerations that have come to the fore as well. For example, in the Punjab, unlike in Bengal, you had another major group of people, the Sikhs. And the Sikhs, unlike the Muslims, their historic homeland was really the Punjab. Right? So what about them? Are they going to get a separate nation state? That idea was ruled out because, of course, you can't have, then you get a balkanization, as they say, right? You can't have all of this kind of fragmentation. But that's one consideration. The second consideration had to do with the fact that there were all these princely states, right? I hope you have not forgotten. I have repeatedly talked about these native states, that 2/3, let me see if I can quickly find the other PowerPoint where I have those slides where you will be able to see if we get this on the board here. But anyhow, while I'm looking for this, let me just tell you what I'm really talking about here is that you had a great many what were called princely or native states. All right, so if you look at this over here, now you get a very good sense of what I'm talking about, India before partition. All these areas shaded in this lighter brown, this is all British India. All of these in the darker brown are native states. Technically autonomous, but remember they could not have their own foreign policy, all of that. Right? There's an agreement between them and British India. Now, what happens to these 550 native states when independence is going to come around? All right? And since we have only 10 minutes left, let me get to the gist of each of these questions. Number one, at the time of independence, so in 1946, the person who's going to become the viceroy is Mountbatten, related to Victoria. All right? Lord Earl Mountbatten of Burma. He's going to become the viceroy. And he's given extraordinary powers by the British, that you have full rights to negotiate everything on behalf of us. You don't have to keep on consulting back and forth with, the cabinet and all of that, right? So he's given these extraordinary powers. One of the things he's going to do is he's going to accelerate the date of independence, right? So it was supposed to be June 1948. He comes and he says, we're going to have independence by August 1947. Now you've got a huge task on your hands. That task is, well, you're going to create a separate nation state, because now it's clear, Muslim League is clear. In Indian National Congress, again, that's a complicated story, because some Indians have argued that the Congress was always opposed to partition. There's a whole school of revisionist history which argues no. In fact, the Congress supported partition too eventually, because they eventually said a centralized Indian nation state, okay, is more important at this juncture than a so-called unified India, which will not be unified because there'll be too much antagonism. All right. So the main thing here is simply that when eventually it is agreed that there's going to be independence, what are the things that we're talking about? Number one, all the princely states are given an option. 3 options. You sign a treaty saying you get absorbed into India, what is going to become India. Treaty option 2, you sign a treaty saying you get absorbed into Pakistan, because the new nation state for the Muslims is going to be called Pakistan. So let's suppose you are a native state over here, Jamnagar, over here. Well, that's in close proximity to what is going to become, Karachi is going to become part of Pakistan. So you might say, oh, the ruler of that will probably say, okay, I want to be part of Pakistan. But you have that option. The third option you have, which is not really an option, right? It's only an option on paper, is you try to become a free, independent state, right? And if we were, this will take us into the history of post-independence, but for various reasons, it's not really going to be an option, all right? That's what's going to happen with respect to these. There are going to be various proposals about one that is floated by Jinnah. Jinnah was astonished, because when he put forward the plan and eventually said, yes, there's going to be Pakistan, he did not think that the Punjab and the Bengal themselves would be partitioned. Do you understand what I mean? He thought all of the Punjab would go over to Pakistan, right? And so therefore he was not thinking, these are the conundrums, he was not really thinking of an Islamic state. This is a misreading by many people who say that, it was created as an Islamic state. No. In fact, Jinnah was a fairly secular person, right? He wanted these rights on behalf of the Muslims, but he himself was a non-believer, a non-believer. And he did not think that Punjab would be partitioned. So when it was said, well, we're going to partition Punjab too, that is what really took him by extraordinary surprise. Now, and the same thing in Bengal, that there was going to be the partitioning of Bengal. So what are going to be the consequences of this partition? Number one, the largest transfer of population in the world of people. 15 million people are going to cross borders, because when the border is drawn, and I have already mentioned to you about the guy who drew the border, right? He was brought over from Britain. He knew nothing about India. He despised the country, Cyril Radcliffe, right? I'm going to encourage you to read a little poem. I don't have time to read it out, by W.H. Auden, which you can find on the internet, one of the great 20th century poets. A poem is simply called Partition. And it's about Cyril Radcliffe, although his name is not mentioned. So Radcliffe is brought out. In 5 weeks, he sits down. He never actually goes to any of these places. He sits in Delhi, pores over maps, and say, okay, this is where we draw the boundaries, right? That's how he does it, effectively. He's assisted, of course, by a number of Indians. And so they're going to draw the boundary in Punjab, in Bengal. One of the proposals that Jinnah had was he wanted a corridor. So the state of Pakistan, imagine, right, that it would not be just this and this on the left and on the right, on the west and the east. There would be a kind of a tunnel. So the tunnel would go through all the Muslim majority villages, and this would all be part of the nation state of Pakistan. There was this proposal that was actually floated of a kind of a safe tunnel or corridor, for the Muslims. But what the consequences are is the largest transfer of people, because when the border is drawn, the consequence, of course, is that those Hindus who get left behind in what is now called Pakistan, which is a Muslim majority state, these Hindus are going to say, we want to move to India. And those Muslims who are left behind over there in what is now India so A chair is Hindus, so the Muslims are going to move from what is India to Pakistan. Very often you have to leave behind your property, your land. 1 million people are going to be killed in this, okay? And exactly the same thing is going to happen on the Bengal side, right? The transfer of population. There are a great many other things here, but that is really what is going to happen. August 14th, Pakistan comes into being, 1947. August 15th, India is going to acquire independence. And that will be the formal end only of British rule. The formal end. Right? And Gandhi himself is going to be assassinated a few months later, but that's a long and complicated part of the story. But this is how it's going to end, in a very unsavory way. It was just as chaotic at the end as it was at the beginning. So a Protestant nation that prided itself on extraordinary efficiency, bureaucratic management, Weberian rationality, all of that, right, created absolute havoc in the beginning and created havoc at the end in 1947. That's worthwhile thinking about, right? Why did it have to end in this particular fashion? And some people, of course, the conservatives in Britain say, we always said that, if we weren't there, you guys would just slaughter each other. Well, I can tell you a lot of Europeans were slaughtering each other, and they didn't need the help of Indians. A lot more were slaughtered in Europe. They mastered the art of social engineering in Europe, not in India. They mastered the art of genocide and of concentration camps in Europe, not in India. And the country where it was done was the height of enlightenment, right? The land of Goethe, Schiller, Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, Kant, Hegel. Yeah, I can go down the list, right? So I don't think we needed lessons from the British there about whether we could live together or not. But the interesting thing, of course, is, and that is really what we would have to do, but that's a separate course, is that I think India and Pakistan actually, even though they were joined at the hip, really drifted apart in some ways. In some ways, and I think it is a striking testimony, not that India is even remotely a paradise, all right? Do not for a moment think that I would ever advocate that view. There are horrors and horrors there too. But I think it is a striking testimony to the pluralism and ecumenism of that country that India today has, apart from Indonesia, the largest Muslim population in the world. Even after the creation of a separate nation state, there are over 150 million Muslims, close to 200 million Muslims living in India. I think it's a salutary lesson for the United States, because I've heard people here say, if a handful of refugees come, the country is being swamped, right? Well, you should see how it is possible for 200 million Muslims or close to that to live
in a country like India, even though the bulk of the Muslims at that time, in 47, went to Pakistan. And Pakistan, today, only 1.5% of its population is Hindu. 1.5%. Pakistan has succeeded admirably well, as some people there would imagine, in homogenizing itself. But that, I don't think, is a story of India. Thank you very much.